This aircraft is maybe one of the absolute most interesting aircraft at this museum. It's an English bomber, an English electric Canberra. First flew in 1949 and was the first heavy jet bomber in the Royal Air Force. For a small country such as Sweden, intelligence about the world around is very important. And in intelligence you also have signal intelligence. That means you have aircraft flying around the borders, listening to signals from countries around Sweden. Signals from radio traffic, radar signals, from which you can learn a lot about how the Air Forces, Armed Forces operates around Sweden. If you look at this model, the striking feature with this aircraft is the enormously big wings. And these wings allow the aircraft to fly at very, very high altitudes, 15, 16 kilometers up in the air. In the aircraft you had one pilot, one navigator and one operator. So actually there were 3 people sitting in this little goldfish bowl. 5 hours up in the air with this machine at those altitudes. It was extremely cold, you have little oxygen, no pressurized cabin, so it was not a pleasure, but it was important. When the Canberra was introduced in the early 50s, it broke a number of world records. Speed and altitude, flew from England to the United States on a record time. The aircraft was in service with the Royal Air Force until around 2005, which is also remarkable for an aircraft that first flew in 1949. This aircraft is called the GV38. It is a Swedish sport aircraft built by a shipyard in Sweden, in Gothenburg. The shipyard's name was Götaverken, and that was the abbreviation GV, and 38 stands for the year of manufacture, 1938. It was a license-produced aircraft from an American manufacturer called Rörvin Sportster 2000. But when the Götaverken, the shipyard, manufactured it, they thought that it was a very, very weak construction. If you're used to build ships, aircraft are very, very fragile. So they increased the strength and the weight of the aircraft everywhere. So the aircraft was very strong, but too heavy. So it could fly, but not very much more. So it was not a very successful aircraft, and only 14 were built just before the war. This specific aircraft was bought by the founder of the museum, Björn Svedfelt, in 1963. He put his name on it, as you can see, and flew around Sweden to demonstrate his skills as a magician and performer, pickpocketer. And in 1964, he should land close to the museum, but the aircraft flipped around and turned on its back, and after that it never flew again. The name Svedino was the artist name of Björn Svedfelt. He was a very famous magician and pickpocketer in the 1950s and 1960s. He traveled around Sweden, performed, and also looked for old cars and old aircraft, and that was the foundation of the collection. The name Björn Svedfelt was not very good if you are a magician. You should have something a little more exotic. So that was the reason he took the name Svedino, which also is the name of the museum. The history of this museum is that it was founded by a man named Björn Svedfelt. He started his interest in aircraft during the Second World War. He was a technician in the Swedish Air Force, and he also started a company producing model aircraft. After a couple of years, he got new interests. In the late 1940s, he turned to be a magician and a pickpocketer, stage performer. And during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, he traveled around Sweden as Mr. Svedino, the magician and pickpocketer. And he also got a new interest, collecting cars, old cars. And the collection grew bigger over the years, and in 1961, it was great enough to open this museum here at Ugglarp in Sweden. At that time it had only 35 old cars. But it grew over the time, and his interest for aircraft came back. So it grew. Today we have around 130 old cars and around 45 old aircraft. Lennart died in 1993, but his museum and his heritage continues. As a young student pilot, this was the first aircraft you get to know in the beginning of your flight training. With this aircraft you flew around 50 flying hours, around half a year of flight training. You started flying it, take-off, landings, flying straight, turning, climbing, diving. Then you continued to more aerobatic flights, steep turns, loopings, rolls, spins. Then you had rudimentary training in instrument flight, following the instruments instead of looking out. Needed if you fly at night or in bad weather. And then finally you trained formation flight. 2 aircraft flying together in a formation, taking off, landing, turning, and some aerobatic in formation. This aircraft was used in the Swedish Air Force at Ljungbyhed from 1971 to the middle of the 1980s. The same type of aircraft was also used in the Royal Air Force Flight Training School in England. It has a cruising speed of around 200 kilometers per hour. This is the Saab 29 Flying Barrel. It made its first flight in 1948, and in 1951 they became operational in the Swedish Air Force. The Swedish Air Force had over 600 of these aircraft flying in the 1950s, and it was the incarnation of a jet aircraft. And every small boy in Sweden that time dreamt about being a flying barrel pilot. This aircraft was the first swept-wing fighter in operational service in Europe in the early 1950s. The swept-wing were only used on the MiG-15 in the Soviet Union and the F-86 Sabre in the United States at that time. The Lansen was used as a warplane from the mid-50s to the mid-70s roughly. So it was used during around 20 years. Then most of them were replaced by the Viggen in the strike version. But when they were phased out, 1 squadron of Lansens remained and was used as an aggressor squadron, an enemy squadron. So when there were training exercises with the Swedish Air Force, this Lansen squadron was the enemy. And they were very, very experienced pilots with experienced navigators and operators behind. So it was really a hard enemy to fight with. And they were also equipped with all kind of modern jamming equipment, so they could jam radars, radio traffic, and all kind of communication. So it was a tough enemy to train against. The Lansen was very much appreciated by the pilots. It was very nice aircraft to fly, had very nice handling characteristics, and also, as I mentioned, it's a 2-seater, the last 2-seater. So you were 2 on board. It was a teamwork. You were never completely alone in the aircraft. And a lot of pilots missed really the navigator when they moved into modern aircraft, more modern aircraft with only 1 seat. The SK-60 was introduced as a jet trainer in the Swedish Air Force in 1967. And from 1986, it was the first aircraft to fly for the new student pilots. And it's flying today, and it will probably fly for many, many decades. It is very easy to modify. They have been putting in the new engines, new electronics, new instruments, but the aircraft itself will continue to fly, probably for another 20 or 30 years, and making it the most long-serving aircraft in the Swedish Air Force history. This specific aircraft here, it's one of the prototypes, the second test and development aircraft, and it was never used in the Air Force. It was used only by Saab. Saab used it after the test phase as a demonstrator aircraft, showing it around the world and trying to seduce customers with this fantastic blue and yellow painting. So it's a very famous aircraft from air shows in the 1970s, 1980s, until it was retired, and now will rest with us here. Here we are in the restoration area of the museum, and we have one of the most classical, most famous aircraft in aviation, which I'm very happy that we have here. It's a MiG-21. But let us listen to someone who can a lot of this aircraft, the hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant General of Aviation, test pilot Stefan Mikoyan.
MiG-21, FC-104 and G-35 Draken were aircraft of one generation. MiG-21, which NATO reporting name was Fishbet, is a supersonic jet fighter aircraft designed by the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau in the Soviet Union. Early versions are considered second-generation jet fighters, while later versions are considered to be third-generation jet fighters. The MiG-21 was the first successful Soviet aircraft combining fighter-interceptor characteristics in a single aircraft. It was a lightweight fighter achieving Mach 2 with a relatively low-powered afterburning turbojet and is thus comparable to the American Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Its basic layout was used for numerous other Soviet designs. The MiG-21 was exported widely and continues to be used. The aircraft's simple controls, engine, weapons, and avionics were typical of Soviet-era military designs. The use of a tail with the delta wing aids stability and control at the extremes of the flight envelope, enhancing safety for lower-skilled pilots. This in turn enhanced its marketability in exports to developing countries with limited training programs and restricted pilot pools. It would be better if my colleague pilot, the director of Svedinos Aviation Museum, Björn Svedfelt, tells about G-35 Draken.
This is one of the most fascinating museum aircraft we have here. It is the very first prototype, the first test aircraft for the Saab 35 Draken. You can see on the nose it's red colored, and that indicates it's test aircraft number 1. It made its first flight October 1955, and it took Sweden into the supersonic age with a speed more than double the speed of sound. It was also the first Saab aircraft with a delta wing, and it even had a double delta wing to give its performance both at low speed and at high speed. So it was really one of the most giant steps in technology for Saab. And at its time, it was one of the world's most advanced aircraft.
During the 60s, 70s and 80s, during the Cold War, MiG-21 and G-35 Draken sometimes met over the Baltic Sea. Our pilots called the Swedish aircraft G-35 Draken Balalaika because of the shape of its wings. As a rule, they greeted each other by wings. They were quite friendly meetings.
This is my favorite aircraft, the Saab Draken. It was produced in a little more than 600 planes by Saab in Linköping, Sweden. The first flight took place in 1955, and the last Drakens were phased out as a military aircraft in the year 2005. It means that the Draken flew operational for 50 years. That is almost half the history of aviation. The Draken mostly flew in the Swedish Air Force, but it was also used in Denmark, Finland and the Austrian Air Force. The Draken in the mid-50s was absolutely the most modern aircraft you could think about. In a time when the delta wing was just beginning to be used in aircraft, Saab made a double delta wing for this aircraft. And it turned out to be a big success. The aircraft could fly fast, it could fly slow, high, low, and be used in all kinds of different situations. It was also the fastest aircraft actually that Saab did produce. The only aircraft from Saab that flew faster than Mach 2. And it was mostly used as a fighter and interceptor aircraft, but there were also one version in Sweden used as a reconnaissance aircraft. In Denmark it was used as a ground attack aircraft. So one single platform turned out to be very useful in many different roles. And the aircraft was improved over its lifetime. Stronger engines, more modern armaments, missiles, more modern radar over the years. And when it was retired in the year 2005, I can tell you that many pilots had tears in their eyes. With the Draken, the Swedish Air Force took the step into the modern age of electronics. It was part of the so-called Stril 60 system, where radar systems detected aircraft around the Swedish borders. That information was automatically, digitally transferred to command and control centers, and take-off scramble orders were given to aircraft Drakens around Sweden at bases. The starting up of the engine of the Draken was very fast. From the pilot got the scramble order, it took less than 1 minute to be airborne, and that was unique. And when the Drakens were approaching the targets, they received data link information. This was a very secret system in Sweden, and we were ahead of the rest of the world with this. It started in 1963, became operational in 1963, and the pilot received automatically steering commands, all kind of information about the target and his intercept course and altitude through the instruments. So the radio could be jammed, but this data link system could not. So the Swedish Air Force was regarded during many years as probably the most efficient air force in the world. This aircraft is a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. As everyone can see, this aircraft is designed to fly fast and fly very fast. It's a narrow fuselage and small, tiny wings. During the Korean War, the US Air Force asked the pilots what they wanted most, and all said, "We want more speed." And speed they got. So Lockheed got the development contract for a very fast aircraft, the Starfighter. It was built to fly fast, to climb fast, shoot down enemy bombers, and then go back to land again. But as also you can understand, it's not very good at turning, so it was a real interceptor. It was not a big success in the United States, but it was one of the great successes for Lockheed in export. So it was used in almost all of the NATO countries. And this specific aircraft belonged to the Danish Air Force and made its last flight in 1986. The Viggen also had reverse thrust to make it possible to land on short and narrow runways. And that was possibility to close the end of the engine outlet and turn the jet forward and thus brake the aircraft even if it was snow or slippery on the runway. Viggen aircraft was designed to be a unity aircraft. The same platform could be used for both fighter missions, strike missions and reconnaissance missions. The first version to be used to be operational was the strike version that was introduced in 1973. In 1980, the fighter version of the Viggen was introduced, and that is the version I have behind me. All versions look very similar on the outside, but the big difference with this fighter version was that it was one of the world's first, maybe the world's first, digital aircraft. An aircraft fully controlled by computers and software. On older aircraft, when you had to make a change, you have to go inside the aircraft, change wires, change black boxes. In the fighter Viggen, you just put in new software, and then you suddenly had completely new functions. So it was revolutionary, as many of the Saab aircraft when they were introduced. This is an autogyro, or also called a gyrocopter. It is not a helicopter, and it's not an aircraft, an ordinary aircraft. It's actually a mix of them, something in between. The rotor ahead of me is not powered by the engine. It rotates only by the speed wind of the autogyro. So you need to move forward all the time. Otherwise, the rotor will stop and you will fall down. It's an aircraft that is a little tricky to fly. It's more dangerous than a normal aircraft. But when you fly it with speed, it behaves more or less like a small aircraft. But when you land and take off, you can use shorter fields than a normal aircraft. For some reason, they are not very popular. There are a few flying around, but probably they are a little too advanced for ordinary pilots. So it belongs more to the history of aviation. The first Soviet autogyro, called the Red Engineer, was developed by the engineers Kamov and Shurinsky, and it flew in 1929. On the first flight, it was flown by the test pilot, Mikhiv, and in the rear cockpit was the designer, Kamov. And the Kamov Design Bureau, after that, established a number of different autogyro